Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 2, Lesson 1, Electoral Considerations. So let's get into it here. So when we talk about electoral considerations, there's really two things that we need to focus on. The first, what type of election is this? Is it a primary, a general, a partisan primary, nonpartisan primary, top two runoff? So we'll need to answer that question. The other question is, who do we expect to vote in this election? These are the two principal things to think about when considering the electoral aspect of your race. So first, let's look at who will likely vote. How do you assess who's going to show up to vote in this election? There's really only a few ways, because this is something that just can't easily be predicted. Political scientists try, but there's just no real certain way here. So the first way is to consider, is this a primary election or is this a general election? And this is a really just blanket rule of thumb. Primary elections typically just see the most partisan voters come out to vote. So if you have a big chunk of the electorate that's Democrat, big chunk of the electorate that's Republican, and a big chunk that's not affiliated or third parties, those ones, non-affiliated third parties, they're a lot less likely to vote in a primary. And then if you take the Democrats and take the Republicans, only the most excited Republicans or most conservative Republicans and almost the most partisan Democrats, the most excited Democrats are going to come out and vote in the primaries. That's just a big rule of thumb that's existed for a while. So that's the first thing that you can think about there. Second, use history as a guide. So you can obtain all sorts of information about past elections from your local voter's office. So it's the county registrar. And it's all public record. You can get voter turnout information from them. Most of this stuff is available online, free, very easy to download and look at it. So that's one way. The third, once you figure out the primary general and then have historical data, then you can layer on things that are a lot less certain and more predictive in nature. So you can think about the national climate. So an example with that is all of the chatter right now by political pundits is about the Democrats having a lot of energy going into the 2018 midterms. Some of that was confirmed actually last night at the time that I'm recording this in the Virginia State House races, the New Jersey governor's race, and a handful of others. There was a question in Maine about healthcare and more elections in Washington. So the big takeaway here is that people think that Democrats have a ton of energy moving into the 2018 elections, 2018 midterm elections, where we'll vote on a third of our U.S. senators and every House member, along with 1 million of other down ballot races. So that's something that you may want to consider on. You look at historical data and then you say, hey, we can expect that maybe 3 to 5%, 7% more Democrats are going to show up in this election because of all this energy. Is that reliable? Is it certain? No, not at all. But you have to use your own judgment there and just make a call and go for it. Other things that you might want to layer on are key races on the ballot. So in 2008, when I was working on a lot of local races in California, we had a race or a ballot initiative on the California state ballot in November 2008, asking California voters if they wanted to add a constitutional amendment that outlawed gay marriage. So that brought a lot of people to the polls. It was a very ugly campaign. Both sides spent around $45 million So all in total, there were $90 million spent blasting the airwaves about gay marriage and gay people, and the yes side just said disgusting, disparaging thing about gay people. It was awful, and they won. It was a disgusting, terrible night. Really, truly horrible night in my life as I look back. But what that did is it brought a lot of people to the polls in November of 2008 that otherwise might have stayed home. You also had this guy on the ballot in the first general election for president named Barack Obama. That brought a ton of people to the polls that otherwise might have stayed home. So you have to think about these big moments in history and what's going to be drawing people to vote that day, other than your standard races that you see normally. And think about ballot initiatives. Those kind of go under the radar and people don't think about them a whole lot. In California, at least, there was always a million ballot initiatives on everything you could possibly imagine. I think it's way overkill. I don't agree with it, but I guess that's a topic for another time. Last thing to think about here is demographics and changing demographics. So if you live in a community that's been changing very rapidly, that's something else you're going to want to consider about who's going to show up to vote. An example here would be if there's a few layers to think about here. So try and think about this very dynamically. So say you're just in an area where tons of people are moving in and they're really not like the community that's there, and you think that they're going to vote different. Maybe it's like a very conservative area and a bunch of people are moving in from the city and buying houses and redoing them, and those people are more liberal, and there's been a huge influx. So that would change when you look at your historical data to today that hasn't been captured in any sort of voting history data. That's going to be different. So that's something to think about. Demographics could be changing and changing the way the voters think and feel. So I remember listening to this podcast at one point, and there was a huge Muslim population moving into a small town in Minnesota, and they were interviewing lots of people, and it was happening very quickly. They were interviewing lots of different people on this podcast and hearing the things that these people said and what they were worried about, and it became this huge issue in the community. So that's something else to think about. It's changing demographics, but not necessarily just voter registration numbers. You have to think about that extra layer of it. And that's also something that will get picked up later in this chapter when we think about issues facing the community. So just think broadly about this and use some historical data and then layer on some assumptions. It's just like how a lot of financial models, a lot of statistical models, it's how all these things are built. They use a chunk of reliable historical data, and then you got to layer on some assumptions to change everything. And that's just the nature of it. So that's how to figure out who will likely vote. The second piece of electoral considerations is to think about what kind of actual race it is. So I'm going to go through the standard types of races and give some tips for best practices in those races. So here we think about a closed primary. So this is very common. I think that there's 3 states in the United States that have top 2 open primaries, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then a handful of other states that use not quite a closed primary, not quite an open primary. So this will talk about closed primary, which is pretty ubiquitous across the United States. So what a closed primary is that all of the Democrats vote to send someone to the general election. All of the Republicans vote to send someone to the general election. All of the other parties vote to, so the Green Party and Independent Party and Working Families Party, all of these parties vote to send someone to the general election to face off in November. So here we have a graphical representation of a district and color-coded by the party. So you can see here we have Democrats making up 45% of the electorate, and Independents making up 30%, Republicans making up 25%. So this is just a hypothetical district, and let's also assume that we're assuming that 100% of these folks are going to turn out to vote. So when you think about this, what a closed primary is that all of these blue voters, these 45%, or we'll just say 45, say there's 100 people voting. These 45 Democrats, they have their own little election. And let's say there's 4 Democrats all running against each other. The other voters don't come into play at all. And then you have your 25 Republicans, and they have 3 or 4 candidates running against each other. Those 25 Republicans vote on those 4 candidates, and only one can proceed from each party. What happens is these 30% independents, folks that don't have a party affiliate, and this isn't like an independent party, like a party called the Independent Party. That's not what I mean by independents. These 30%, these are people that are not affiliated with any party at all. They choose to not have a party affiliation. So they don't participate in the primary at all. And so they're just not part of this election. So what's happening here is the 45 or the handful of Democrats that are running in the Democratic primary, the only people that they have to win over are Democrats. And the people that show up to vote in primaries are normally the most die-hard Democrats. So what's going to happen is that candidates running in a closed primary like this, the Democratic candidates are going to be the biggest Democrats that they can, because that's the people that they're going after for votes. Republicans are going to be the most Republican that they can, the most conservative that they can. They're going to be towing the party line in an extreme way, because that's who they have to appeal to in order to get those votes. So my recommendation for you is to simply do the same thing. I wish I had something brighter to say here, but I really don't. So for a closed primary, you need to take a deeper dive on what the Democrats in your district are like, or what the Republicans in your district are like, and shape your campaign accordingly. But please know that in a closed primary, you're going to be chasing after the most enthusiastically Democratic voters. So that's what you need to consider there. So closed primary, key takeaways from that: focus on party issues. So if you know that like infrastructure is a really big deal in your district, but Democrats in general, sure, they might care about infrastructure, but is it the top 5, top 4, top 3 issues for them? If it's not, you probably shouldn't be focusing on it in a closed primary. Okay, so focus on those issues that really fire up the party base. Second key takeaway here: adopt positions that are in line with your party. Certainly, you're not going to be selling your soul and adopting positions that you don't agree with it whatsoever, but in general, you can't stray too far from your party here. Third, in a closed primary, institutional support is going to be very key. So when I say institutional support, I mean if you're running in a Republican primary, you're going to need like the Chamber of Commerce. You're going to need the NRA. You're going to need these like real, like true red organizations that support Republican candidates all the time. On the Democratic side, you're going to need to go after the big labor organizations, civil rights, human rights organizations, environmental organizations. These are all going to be super critical in a closed primary. What many primary voters in closed primaries utilize guides from these organizations that show the candidates that they support, and they will actually take that guide into the polling booth with them and say, okay, I really care about the environment, and I'm never going to vote for a Republican. So general election, I don't worry about, because I just vote the Democratic ballot. Don't even worry about independents, Republicans. I vote Democrat all the time. But in the primary, I'm not sure, because there's all these Democrats, and I Googled them. They all look pretty good. They're going to take that scorecard from the from like the Conservation Club of Southern Florida, and they're going to go into the ballot or go into the polling booth, and they're going to take it out and they're going to say, okay, for state representative District 2, they recommend this person. They recommend this person for Congress, and they're going to vote who those people recommend. All that to say, guys, institutional support, super critical in a close primary. And so, but you don't just want to be this standard, oh, here I am, your typical Democrat adopting every single issue. So it's very critical that you figure out that distinguishing edge. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this campaign ad that was floating around summer of 2017. This woman who's running for Congress in a pretty conservative seat, she's running as a Democrat. She's probably going to be facing other Democratic competitors, and she's probably going to adopt positions that are very similar to a lot of other Democrats that will run in that race. But she had this like outstanding campaign announcement video where she talks about her history as like the first Navy jet pilot landing on aircraft carriers, and how she served her country, and there's all these pictures of her standing in front of these like sick like F-16 jets, and like it's amazing, and like that is a distinguishing edge. Very, very, very well done. So if you didn't land an F-16 on a battle zone, then sorry, you can't run for office, so turn off this course. Now, kidding, obviously, but figure out a way to give yourself that distinguishing edge. Okay, moving on to open primary. So what an open primary is it's very similar to a local race for like city council. This is very common in city council races, where it's the top two. So you'll have a big pool of folks running for a particular office. Let's say it's a state senate district. Say I'm running for New York State Senate. Actually, we'll use California as the example because California has open primaries. So if I'm running for State Senate District 10, their open primary system there, it doesn't have any regard to parties. So what happens is I declare myself as a Democrat, and it's visible on the ballot, or an independent or a Republican or whatever, but all the voters that are registered Democrat, all the voters that are registered Republican, all the non-affiliated, everybody gets to vote on the same pool of candidates. So let's look at our illustration here. So same as before, we have 45 Democrat voters, 30 independent voters, 25 Republican voters. So then let's say we have 5 candidates running. We have 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Then all 100 of these voters cast their votes for these 5 candidates. And then the top 2 candidates, top 2 vote getters, they move on to the general election. So let me just explain that one more time. All of these voters, their party is just kind of thrown out the window. And they just vote on all 5 candidates, regardless of what party that is. So what happens here is previously, you just had these blue voters here, these Democrats, voting for the different Democrats that were running. And what happened is that the Democratic candidates chase only Democratic voters, and they become the most Democratic person possible. Well, in an open primary, you could be a moderate Democrat. And let's see if I can make my pointer work here. So you could just capture these Democrats here that are closer to the middle. So you just capture, you're not going to be hardcore Democrat. You're going to be adopting some more moderate positions. But in doing so, you're going to be capturing some of these middle voters that are registered declined to state. So let's say you pick up like 20% of the Democrats, all of the unaffiliated and independent voters, and then on top of that, you pick up like 10% or so of the Republicans. Well, you know what? That's a good chunk of the voters. That's a really good chunk of the voters. and then say the rest of the Democrats are split among like a couple of other Democratic candidates, and then the rest of the Republican voters are split among 2 other Republican candidates. So what's happened, you've carved out a huge chunk of the electorate, and you end up one of the top 2 vote getters, and then you move on to the general election in November. So I hope that makes sense. Basically, what it does is, in an open primary, candidates can chase after the votes of everyone in the district. You don't care what party they are, you just want them to vote for you. And I love this. I wish the entire country did this. It makes so much more sense, and I really, total sidebar. The partisan primaries in our country are poisoning this entire nation. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. Open primaries, they're the way to go. They're a necessity. Okay, now I'm off my soapbox. Okay, so open primaries, what are the key takeaways here? So you want to capture as many votes as possible from anybody. You're just out there getting those votes. Competitive analysis here is super, super critical. So like I just said, if you're trying to carve out a chunk of the electorate for you, and let's say it's like, okay, you're going to shave off some of the Democrats for stances on certain issues, like you're like a really, really, really strong labor guy or labor girl, and you are going to capture a bunch of labor Democrats. And then you have a bunch of middle of the road positions, so you're going to capture a bunch of independents, and then a handful like conservative positions, you're going to be able to grab some Republicans. Okay, that's great. But being able to assess your other candidates and what chunks of the electorate they're going to go after and what chunks you can reasonably compete with them for, that's going to be super, super, super critical in this process. So you really have to sit down and take a good hard look at the other candidates, and it might be a fairly large pool. I used a state Senate race earlier. It would not be uncommon for there to be 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, a handful of independents, a good chunk of people chasing 1 state Senate seat in California. So you got to sit down, you got to make those lists of the other candidates, figure out where they stand on the issues, what sort of things they're going to be talking about, what sort of pieces of the electorate they're going to be going after, where you can reasonably compete with them and win over voters, and carve out that piece for yourself. It's a tough thing to do. So, third key takeaway here for an open primary: let historical voter turnout guide you. So look at who has been turning out, just like in that exercise we did at the beginning of this lesson, to see who you expect to turn out, layer on all those other factors, have a nice spreadsheet, segment it all out, and think hard about the different pieces that are going to turn out, and layer it on with your competitive analysis of your other competitors to carve out who you're really going to be able to go after there. Fourth tip here, stay away from negative campaigning in a primary like this. I really think that negative campaigning has a place. It has an important place, but it's better served in a general election when it's between 2 people. If one candidate goes negative, it's going to cause another one to go negative, another one to go negative, another one to go negative. So, and they probably will start going negative. There's a large pool of people. Somebody's bound to go negative, and then it's dominoes. And then everybody's going negative. And you know who stands out? The one person that doesn't go negative. The one person that maintains a nice, positive campaign. So the takeaway here is, if you stay positive, you will stay above. And if nobody else goes negative, then hey, everybody has a positive campaign, and you're all running on the same footing. But if somebody does go negative and the dominoes fall and everybody's running this negative punching campaign, then hey, you're the one that's rising above. So stay positive no matter what in that primary. Okay, third here, general election. This is what everybody's most familiar with. So we have 2 people that came out of the primary. Could have been an open primary, could have been a closed primary. And open primary, that is also, I'm not sure how clear I stated this earlier, but the dynamics for an open primary, that's identical for a nonpartisan local city race. where you have folks running against each other in a top 2 runoff. So for the general election, just like we know, we have our handy dandy district here, 45% Dem, 30% Independent, 25% Republican. And so now the candidates are facing off against everybody. So you could have Democrat candidate chasing after Republican voters and everybody in between. So we know the drill here. So let's take a look at some of the key takeaways for a general election. So this is the tried and true advice that everybody always hears, and it's most commonly given when you go from a closed primary to a general election, but basically it's move to the center. So if you're adopting more party line, like towing the party line issues in the primary, then you're going to need to move to the center a little bit, soften your stance on some of those issues, and be able to capture these voters that are in the middle. So it's tried and true advice, and I'm not going to give you any different here. I think it's the best advice to give here. So if you do plan on going negative, like I mentioned earlier, now is the time to do it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like being this angel or this stellar candidate means that you don't go negative and that somehow makes you a better person. No. Politics is dirty. Politics is crazy. And there are people that run for office that say and do terrible things, and they need to be called out, and the electorate needs to know about it. We have one of the most disgusting candidates that ever wrote, like, the worst, most terrible campaign ever, and said the most terrible things throughout his life. Donald Trump, obviously, I'm talking about. And Hillary was right in running a negative campaign from the start. Educating the electorate about the disgusting, terrible things that that man did was the smartest strategy she could have taken. And that's what she did. Because those things need to be talked about. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you any different. So if you're running against someone that's said and done terrible things, then you call them out on it in the general election. That's my tip. Not in the primary. So third, ditch party labels. This is pretty straightforward. You're running in the general election. If somebody's a Republican and they just have this distaste for Democrats in general, you don't need to remind them that you're a Democrat, or vice versa. So there's no, in the general election, there's no need to be calling out your party affiliation. It'll be clearly stated on the ballot, so it's not a secret at all. But when you're out talking to voters and on your campaign literature, you don't need to be mentioning it in the general election. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. This is really laying the most basic framework to work off of as we start crafting your campaign message in greater detail. So stay tuned. We're really diving in deep in the next lesson. We'll bust out this issue database that I've created for you guys. I'm going to show you how it works, show you how to put all the information into it, show you what it predicts for you, and show you how it tells you how to talk about issues. It's going to be very handy. So I know this is a lot of information, guys. You might have to watch this video a second time. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments and get involved, and be happy to help you however I can. So thanks a lot. We'll see you in the next lesson.